The wind howled through the Colorado mountains with a fury that could freeze a man's soul, and Yates Sullivan knew that any creature caught outside tonight would likely be dead by morning. He pushed through the knee-deep snow toward his barn, the lantern in his massive hand swaying with each labored step, casting wild shadows across the white landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The February blizzard of 1878 was the worst Rico had seen in a decade, and Yates had spent the last hour making sure his horses and livestock were secure before the temperature dropped even further. His broad shoulders were dusted white with snow, his dark hair hanging past his collar and plastered against his weathered face, and his thick beard was already forming icicles despite the wool scarf wrapped around his neck. He was a mountain of a man, standing well over 6 feet with arms like tree trunks and a chest that strained against his heavy coat, the kind of build that came from years of splitting wood, hauling water, and surviving alone in the unforgiving wilderness. When he pulled open the barn door, fighting against the wind that tried to rip it from his hands, he expected to find nothing but his 2 horses stamping nervously in their stalls and perhaps a raccoon that had sought shelter from the storm. What he found instead made him stop dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat despite the cold air that rushed into his lungs. Huddled together in the far corner, buried under a thin layer of hay that they had clearly pulled over themselves, were 3 small forms. Children. 3 children, their faces pale as death, their lips tinged blue, their small bodies trembling so violently that the hay around them shook like grass in summer wind. Yates was moving before his mind fully processed what he was seeing, his heavy boots thudding across the wooden floor as he dropped to his knees beside them. The oldest was a girl, maybe 10 or 11, with tangled brown hair and eyes that flickered open briefly when his shadow fell across her face. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. Wrapped in her arms was a younger girl, perhaps 6 or 7, with blonde curls matted against her forehead, and pressed against her side was a boy who could not have been more than 4, his face buried against his sister's threadbare coat. They were wearing clothes meant for autumn, not a mountain winter, and their shoes were little more than scraps held together with string. "Jesus Christ," Yates breathed, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone, had done so for the better part of 5 years since coming to these mountains, and he rarely spoke except to his horses or the occasional trapper who passed through. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard work, moved with surprising gentleness as he gathered the oldest girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel every bone in her body through her thin clothing. "I have got you," he said, his voice firmer now, carrying the authority of a man who had faced down grizzlies and survived avalanches. "You are going to be all right." He carried her to the house first, kicking open his front door and laying her on the thick bearskin rug in front of his fireplace. The fire was still burning strong. He had stoked it before going out to check the barn, and the cabin was blessedly warm. He ran back through the storm, his heart pounding in a way it had not since the war, since he had carried wounded men from the battlefield at Gettysburg, since he had held his younger brother as life drained from him in the mud. He pushed those memories away and focused on the task at hand, grabbing the younger girl next, then the boy, making 2 more trips through snow that was now falling so thick he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. When all 3 children were laid out on his floor, he went to work with the efficiency of a man who understood that hesitation meant death. He stripped off their wet clothes without ceremony, wrapping each of them in wool blankets from his bed, rubbing their limbs to restore circulation, checking their fingers and toes for frostbite. The oldest girl was conscious now, watching him with wide, terrified eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. The younger 2 were still barely responsive, their breathing shallow and rapid. "What are your names?" Yates asked as he worked, his voice gentler than he would have thought possible. He was not a gentleman by nature. Life had beaten that out of him years ago. The girl's lips moved, and he had to lean close to hear her whispered response. "Rose. Rose Jenkins. My sister is Lily. My brother is Thomas." Her voice cracked on the last name, and tears began to spill down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. "Our parents. They are dead. The fever took them. We had nowhere to go." Yates felt something twist in his chest, something he had thought long dead and buried. He had built this life in the mountains specifically to avoid feeling anything at all, to escape the memories and the pain and the guilt that had followed him home from the war. He was 32 years old and had spent the last 5 years convincing himself that solitude was not just preferable but necessary. He was not father material. He was not even sure he was human material anymore. He was just a man and his horses and the mountains that asked nothing of him but respect and caution. "How long were you in my barn?" he asked, continuing to rub warmth into Lily's small hands. 2 days, Rose whispered. "Maybe 3. I lost track. We were trying to get to Denver. Someone said there was an orphanage there. But we had no money for the stage and we got lost in the mountains. When the storm came, we saw your barn. I thought if we could just wait out the storm." 2 or 3 days. These children had been slowly freezing to death not 50 yards from his house for days, and he had not known. If he had not gone out tonight, if he had decided the animals could wait until morning, he would have found 3 small corpses in his barn come sunrise. The thought made his hands shake slightly as he tucked the blanket more securely around Thomas, who was finally starting to show signs of true consciousness, his eyes fluttering open to reveal the same brown as his older sister's. "You are in Rico," Yates said, "about 80 miles southwest of where you want to be, and there is no getting anywhere until this storm passes. You are safe now. I'm going to make you something warm to drink, and then you're going to sleep, and we will figure out the rest tomorrow." He stood and moved to his small kitchen, putting a pot of water on the stove and adding honey, whiskey, and herbs. It was a recipe his mother had used when he was young and caught cold, back when he still had a mother and a family, and a life that made sense. He brought the warm mixture to each child in turn, supporting their heads as they sipped, coaxing them to take just a little more. Rose drank hers with the desperate gratitude of someone who had given up hope and found it again, while Lily and Thomas needed more encouragement, their bodies still too cold and shocked to fully cooperate. The storm raged outside for 3 more days, and during that time, Yates Sullivan's carefully constructed solitary life began to crack and crumble like ice in spring thaw. He gave the children his bed and slept on the floor by the fire, though sleep came in fits and starts as he kept waking to check on them to make sure they were still breathing, still alive. He cooked meals of venison stew and cornbread, foods he had been making for himself in quantities meant for 1, now stretched to feed 4. He watched as color slowly returned to their faces, as their shivers subsided, as life reasserted itself in small ways. A smile from Lily, a laugh from Thomas, a moment when Rose's eyes showed something other than fear and grief. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke, and weak winter sunlight streamed through the cabin windows. Thomas, who had barely spoken since regaining consciousness, climbed onto Yates's lap while he sat in his chair whittling a piece of wood. The boy just sat there, his small body fitting against Yates's broad chest like he belonged there, and something in the mountain man's heart that had been frozen for 5 years began to thaw. "Are you going to send us away?" Rose asked that evening. She was standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape with the expression of someone who had learned not to trust in good things lasting. "To the orphanage in Denver?" Yates looked at her, then at Lily, who was playing with a doll he had hastily fashioned from cloth and string, then at Thomas, who was already half asleep by the fire. He thought about the life he had built here, the isolation he had craved, the peace he had found in having no one to lose. He thought about his brother dying in his arms, about coming home to find his parents had succumbed to cholera while he was gone, about the way he had run from every connection and responsibility, because the pain of loss was too great to bear again. But he also thought about finding these 3 small bodies in his barn, about how close they had come to death, about how Thomas's hand felt in his, how Rose tried so hard to be brave, how Lily had started smiling again. He thought about the empty years stretching ahead, years of talking to no one but his horses, years of pretending he was content when he was really just hiding. "No," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he had not let himself feel in half a decade. "I'm not sending you anywhere. If you want to stay, you can stay, for as long as you need." Rose turned from the window, and the expression on her face, hope and disbelief and desperate longing all mixed together, nearly broke him. "You mean it? We can stay with you?" "I'm not much for talking, and I work hard. And I do not know the first thing about raising children, Yates said honestly. But I have got a roof and food and room enough for all of us. And I will be damned if I am letting you three go back out into the world with nothing and no one. Lily looked up from her doll. Does that mean you are our papa now? The word hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he could not breathe. Papa. He had never expected to be anyone's papa, had actively avoided even the possibility. But 3 pairs of eyes were watching him now, waiting for his answer, and he found he could not bear to disappoint them. I suppose it does, he said softly, if that's what you want. Thomas scrambled up and threw his small arms around Yates's neck, holding on with the fierce desperation of a child who had lost everything and found something precious again. Lily followed, and then rose, all 3 of them clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself treacherous and cruel. Yates wrapped his massive arms around them and held on, his eyes burning with tears he would not let fall, and wondered how his life had changed so completely in the span of 4 days. The weeks that followed were an education in chaos and compromise. Yates had to learn how to braid hair, a task that left his thick fingers fumbling and Rose giggling at his attempts, until she finally took over and showed him the proper way. He had to remember to cook 3 meals a day instead of just eating whenever he was hungry. He had to answer endless questions from Thomas about everything from why snow was white to where babies came from, the latter making him stammer and redirect the boy's attention to something less complicated. He had to comfort nightmares and settle arguments and figure out how to make the small cabin feel like enough space for 4 people who were still learning how to be a family. But there were good moments too, moments that surprised him with their sweetness. Teaching Thomas to whittle small animals from wood scraps, watching Lily's face light up when he brought home a book of fairy tales from his rare trip into town. Seeing Rose slowly relax, the permanent tension in her shoulders easing as she realized she did not have to carry the weight of the world anymore, that there was an adult she could trust to keep them safe. Rico was a small mining town, just a few hundred people clustered in the narrow valley surrounded by towering peaks. Most folks kept to themselves, but word spread quickly about Yates Sullivan and the 3 orphans he had taken in. Some people thought he was crazy, a bachelor mountain man trying to raise 3 children alone. Others respected him for it, brought by supplies they thought might help, offered advice he did not always want but appreciated nonetheless. It was during one of these town visits, in late March, when the snow was finally starting to melt and the world was thinking about spring, that Yates first saw her. He was loading supplies into his wagon while the children picked out candy in the general store, and he happened to glance up as a woman walked past. She was tall and slender, with auburn hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She wore a practical gray dress and carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from someone comfortable in her own skin. She was beautiful, but it was not just her looks that made him stare. It was something in the way she moved, purposeful and independent, like she answered to no one but herself. "That is Miss Rebecca," the shopkeeper said, following Yates's gaze with a knowing smile. "Rebecca Johnson. Came to town about 6 months back from St. Louis. Runs the schoolhouse down on Main Street. Smart as a whip and twice as fierce. Half the eligible men in town have tried courting her, but she has turned them all down flat." Yates grunted, forcing himself to look away. He had no business thinking about women, not now when he was still figuring out how to be a father to 3 traumatized children. But his eyes drifted back to her despite his best intentions, watching as she stopped to help an elderly woman carry her packages, her smile warm and genuine. "Papa, can we get peppermint sticks?" Lily came running out of the store, her blonde curls bouncing, Thomas close on her heels. Rose followed more sedately, but even she had a lightness to her step that had not been there a month ago. Papa still sounded strange to Yates's ears, but he was getting used to it. Getting used to being needed, being relied on, being loved in that uncomplicated way that children loved when they felt safe. "1 each," he said, reaching for his coin purse, "and you will make them last." When he looked up again, Rebecca Johnson was watching him with an expression of surprise and something else he could not quite identify. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and he felt a jolt run through him like lightning striking a tree. She smiled slightly, a small quirk of her lips, and then continued on her way, disappearing into the post office. Yates stood there like an idiot, his hand still in his pocket, until Rose tugged on his sleeve. "Who was that lady?" she asked, too perceptive for her own good. "No one," Yates said gruffly, turning back to his wagon. "Come on, we have got a long ride home." But Rebecca Johnson was not no one, and Yates found himself thinking about her more often than he wanted to admit over the following weeks. He told himself it was foolish, that he was too rough and unsocialized for someone like her, that he had his hands full with the children and did not need any complications. But then Rose mentioned that she wanted to go to school, that she missed reading and learning, and Yates found himself making plans to take her into town to meet the teacher. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building with a bell tower and windows that let in the spring sunshine. Classes were in session when they arrived, and Yates could hear the sound of children reciting their multiplication tables. He knocked on the doorframe, his hat in his hands, suddenly feeling like he was 16 instead of 32. Rebecca Johnson opened the door, and up close she was even more striking than he had remembered. She was probably in her mid-20s, with a dusting of freckles across her nose and a firm set to her jaw that suggested she did not back down from challenges. When she saw him, something flickered in her eyes, recognition and interest and a hint of wariness. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice cultured but not pretentious, carrying the hint of education and Eastern refinement. "I heard you were taking care of the Jenkins children. This must be Rose." "Yes, madam," Yates managed, feeling Rose press closer to his side. "She wants to go to school. I know it is late in the year, but I figured learning is important." Rebecca's expression softened, and she knelt down to Rose's level. "What grade were you in before, sweetheart?" "Fourth," Rose said quietly. "But I have missed a lot. Our mama taught us at home mostly before she got sick." "Well, I think we can get you caught up," Rebecca said with a warm smile that made something flutter in Yates's chest. "Why do not you come in and meet the other children? We will be breaking for lunch soon, and you can see if you like it here." Rose looked up at Yates, seeking permission, and he nodded. She went inside, leaving him standing on the porch with Rebecca, the silence stretching between them in a way that was not quite comfortable but not unpleasant either. "That is kind of you," Rebecca said finally, taking them in. Not many men would do that. Yates shrugged his massive shoulders, uncomfortable with praise. Could not leave them to freeze. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Rebecca said firmly, her green eyes meeting his blue ones with an intensity that made his heart skip. "They would not have. I've seen too many people turn away from hard things, from responsibilities that were not theirs to bear. What you did, what you are doing, it is good. Those children are lucky to have you." He did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded awkwardly and turned to leave. But Rebecca's voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan, would you like to stay for lunch? We usually just have simple things, bread and cheese, but you are welcome to join us. You could see how Rose does with the other children." It was a practical offer, nothing more, but Yates found himself accepting anyway. He spent the next hour sitting at a desk built for someone half his size, watching Rose slowly come out of her shell as the other children welcomed her with the easy acceptance of youth. Rebecca taught with passion and patience, making even arithmetic seem interesting, and Yates found himself watching her more than he watched anything else. The way she moved around the room, the way she encouraged a shy boy to speak up, the way she laughed when one of her students made a joke. When lunch ended and classes resumed, Yates reluctantly took his leave, promising Rose he would be back to pick her up when school let out. Rebecca walked him to the door again, and this time when their hands accidentally brushed, he felt that same lightning strike, electric and undeniable. "She will do well here," Rebecca said. "She is bright and resilient. You have done right by her." "I am trying," Yates said honestly. "It is all new to me, being responsible for anyone but myself." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see straight through him, past the walls he had built, to the scared, lonely man underneath. "New is not the same as bad," she said quietly. "Sometimes new is exactly what we need." He thought about those words all the way home, thought about them as he chopped wood and tended to his horses and helped Lily with her letters while Thomas played with wooden blocks Yates had carved. He thought about them that night as he lay on his bedroll by the fire, listening to the children sleep in the loft he had recently built to give them more space. New was terrifying. New meant being vulnerable again, meant risking pain and loss. But new also meant Rose's smile when she came home from her first full day of school, bursting with stories about everything she had learned. New meant Thomas calling him Papa without any hesitation. New meant Lily hugging him goodnight like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe, he thought as sleep finally took him, maybe new was not something to fear. Spring turned to summer and a routine established itself. Rose went to school every day, thriving under Rebecca's instruction, while Lily and Thomas stayed home with Yates. He taught them practical things, how to tend a garden, how to collect eggs from the chickens he had bought, how to identify edible plants in the forest. But he also played with them, something he had not done since he was a child himself. He pushed them on the swing he had hung from a sturdy pine tree. He told them stories about his own childhood in Ohio, carefully edited to leave out the war and the pain. He let them help him with chores, even when it made everything take twice as long. And every day when he went to pick Rose up from school, he saw Rebecca. At first it was just polite greetings and updates on Rose's progress, but gradually conversations lengthened. Rebecca mentioned that she needed help repairing some loose boards on the schoolhouse steps, and Yates found himself offering to fix them. While he worked, she brought him lemonade, and they talked about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about becoming a teacher because she loved learning and wanted to share that with children, about coming west because she wanted adventure and independence. He told her about his horses, about the beauty of the mountains, about the peace he had found in solitude before it became loneliness. "Why did you come here?" she asked one day in June, sitting on the steps while he hammered a new board into place. "To Rico, to the mountains, you do not strike me as someone who grew up in wilderness." Yates paused, considering how much to share. He was not used to talking about himself, about his past, but there was something about Rebecca that made him want to try. "I was in the war," he said finally, "fought for the Union, saw things no one should see, did things I wish I could forget. When I came home, everyone I loved was dead or gone. I figured it was easier to be alone than to risk losing anyone else." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "And now you have 3 children depending on you. That must be terrifying." "It is," he admitted, meeting her eyes, "every single day, but it is also the best thing that has ever happened to me. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," she said softly. "Love is always terrifying. That is how you know it is real." Love. The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Yates wanted to ask if she was talking about his love for the children or something else, something that was growing between the two of them in these stolen moments of conversation and shared glances. But he was not brave enough yet, so he just went back to hammering, and Rebecca went back inside to prepare the next day's lessons. In July, the town held its annual summer festival, a celebration of the brief warm months before winter returned to reclaim the mountains. There was music and dancing, food vendors and games for children. Yates had not planned to go, but Rose begged him, and Lily and Thomas joined in until he could not say no. He put on his cleanest shirt and his newest pants, feeling absurdly nervous, and loaded the children into the wagon for the trip into town. The main street had been transformed, decorated with bunting and lanterns, filled with people laughing and celebrating. Thomas immediately ran off to watch a puppet show, Lily close behind him, and Rose spotted some girls from school and asked if she could join them. Yates agreed, reminding them to stay where he could see them, and then found himself standing alone in the middle of the crowd, feeling out of place and conspicuous. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," a familiar voice said behind him, amusement clear in her tone. He turned to find Rebecca standing there, and his breath caught. She was wearing a green dress that brought out her eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up, and she looked so beautiful it almost hurt to look at her. "Not much for crowds," he managed. "Me neither," she confessed. "I usually spend these things making sure my students do not get into too much trouble. But they all seem occupied at the moment, so I find myself with rare free time. Would you like to walk with me?" They walked to the edge of town where the noise faded and the evening air was cooler, talking about everything and nothing. Yates told her about how Thomas had caught his first fish last week, how proud the boy had been. Rebecca told him about Rose's progress, how she was already caught up with her grade level and showing signs of being truly gifted. They talked until the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and Yates realized he had never felt this comfortable with anyone, this able to just be himself. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said as they stood watching the sunset. Why have you never married? You are kind and hard-working and good with children. I cannot imagine there were not women interested." Yates was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I suppose I never saw the point. I was not planning to have a family, was not planning to let anyone close. It seemed unfair to promise someone a future I could not give them." He paused, then added, "But things change. People change." Rebecca turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes seemed to glow. "Yes," she said softly, "they do." He wanted to kiss her then, wanted it so badly his hands shook with the restraint it took not to reach for her. But they were in public, and he was not sure she wanted that, was not sure he had the right to assume. So he just stood there like a fool, the moment stretching and then breaking as Thomas came running up, shouting about the fireworks that were about to start. August brought the heat of summer in full force, and with it, new challenges. A group of rough miners moved into the hills above Yates's property, and he began finding signs that they were trespassing, hunting his land, leaving trash and disturbing his animals. He tried talking to them, asking them politely to respect his boundaries, but they laughed in his face and made crude comments about him playing house with 3 orphans. He kept his temper, barely, and rode away. But he started carrying his rifle more often when he went out, and he made sure the children stayed close to the cabin. Rebecca noticed his tension when he came to pick up Rose from school, the hard set of his jaw, and the way his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings. "What is wrong?" she asked quietly when the children were out of earshot. He told her about the miners, about his concerns. Rebecca listened with a frown, then said, "You should talk to Sheriff Matthews. Those men have caused trouble in town too, getting drunk and starting fights. Maybe he can do something." "Maybe," Yates said, but he had little faith in the law. He had learned during the war that sometimes a man had to protect what was his own because no one else would. His fears proved founded when he came home one afternoon to find one of the miners in his yard, clearly drunk, leering at Rose, who was hanging laundry. Yates saw red. He was off his horse and across the yard, in seconds, his hand closing on the man's collar and lifting him clear off the ground, despite the miner being a large man himself. The difference was that Yates was larger, stronger, and fueled by protective fury that gave him near superhuman strength. "You have 3 seconds to get off my property," Yates growled, his voice so low and dangerous it barely sounded human. "And if I ever see you near my children again, I will bury you in these mountains where no one will ever find you." The miner paled, suddenly sober enough to recognize the very real threat in Yates's eyes. When Yates released him, he stumbled backward, then turned and ran, shouting threats over his shoulder about how his friends would hear about this. Rose stood frozen, her face pale, and Yates immediately gentled his expression and went to her. "Are you all right? Did he touch you?" "No," she whispered. "He just said. He said things. Awful things. I was scared." Yates pulled her into a hug, his heart pounding with residual rage and fear. "I'm sorry you had to see that, but you are safe. I will always keep you safe." That night, after the children were asleep, Yates sat on his porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. He knew the miners might come back, might try to cause real trouble. He was prepared to defend his family with lethal force if necessary, but he hoped it would not come to that. He had killed enough men during the war. He did not want to add to that count, but he would if he had no choice. Around midnight, he heard horses approaching. He stood, his rifle ready, and was surprised when Rebecca rode into his yard, a lantern in her hand. She dismounted quickly and hurried toward him, her face worried in the lamplight. "I heard what happened," she said breathlessly. "In town, people were talking. Some of those miners were in the saloon, threatening to come up here and teach you a lesson. I was worried." Yates was stunned that she had ridden up here alone in the dark, risking her safety because she was worried about him. "Rebecca, you should not be here. It is dangerous." "Which is exactly why I came," she said firmly, climbing the porch steps to stand beside him. "You should not be alone if they come." "I have handled worse than drunk miners," he said, but he was touched by her concern, by her courage. "But thank you. For caring. For coming." They stood together in the darkness, watching and waiting. Rebecca stayed close to his side, and Yates found himself hyper-aware of her presence, the warmth of her body, the sound of her breathing. Hours passed, and no one came. Perhaps the miners had been all talk, or perhaps seeing Rebecca's horse had made them reconsider. Either way, as dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Yates realized something had shifted between them. "I should go," Rebecca said reluctantly as the sun rose, "before anyone in town notices I was gone all night. My reputation is already scandalous enough, being an unmarried woman living alone." "Rebecca," Yates said, catching her hand before she could mount her horse. His heart was pounding, and he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump. "I need you to know. These past months, getting to know you, talking to you, it has meant everything to me. You have meant everything to me." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes searching his. "Yates, I know I am not much," he continued, the words pouring out now that he had started. "I am rough and awkward, and I live in the middle of nowhere with 3 children who are not even mine by blood. I know you could do better, that you probably have men courting you who have more to offer. But I'm asking anyway. Can I court you proper? Can I try to win your heart?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You fool," she said softly, reaching up to touch his bearded face. "You already have my heart. You have had it since that first day you came to my schoolhouse, looking terrified and determined, wanting to do right by Rose. I have been waiting for you to notice." Yates let out a breath he had not known he was holding, and then he was kissing her, his large hands gentle as they cradled her face. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, and he felt something slot into place inside him, something he had not known was missing. They broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, and Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier than he expected. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you." "I love you too," Rebecca whispered. "All of you. Your strength and your gentleness and your capacity to love those children despite being terrified of losing them. I love everything you are." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring it, and when they finally pulled apart, the sun was fully up, and Yates could hear the children stirring inside the cabin. Rebecca mounted her horse reluctantly, but before she left, Yates caught her hand one more time. "Will you come to dinner tonight? All proper, so the children can get used to the idea of us, of you being part of this family." Rebecca's smile could have lit up the darkest night. "I would love nothing more." The children were predictably excited when Yates told them Rebecca was coming for dinner. Rose immediately began helping him clean the cabin, while Lily picked wildflowers to put on the table. Thomas asked if this meant Miss Rebecca was going to be their mama, and Yates had to explain that these things took time, even though his own heart was already racing ahead to thoughts of marriage and forever. Rebecca arrived just as the sun was setting, carrying a pie she had baked and wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her look even more beautiful than usual. Dinner was a lively affair, the children competing for her attention, showing her their treasures and accomplishments. Yates watched from the head of the table, his heart so full he thought it might burst. This, he thought, this was what happiness felt like. This was what he had been afraid to want. After the children went to bed, Yates and Rebecca sat on the porch in the cool evening air, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They talked about the future, about what courting would look like given the challenges of distance and propriety and 3 children who needed attention. They talked about practicalities and dreams, and by the time Rebecca rode home, both of them were smiling like fools. The summer faded into autumn, and Yates courted Rebecca with a single-minded determination that surprised even him. He was not a romantic man by nature, but he found himself picking wildflowers for her, carving her little trinkets from wood, writing her letters that took him hours to compose because he wanted every word to be perfect. Rebecca received all of it with joy and gave back in equal measure, baking treats for him and the children, helping Rose with her advanced studies, teaching Lily and Thomas their letters during weekend visits. The children adored her, and she adored them right back. Yates watched her with them and saw the natural mother she would be, the way she could be firm and loving in equal measure, the way she made them feel safe and cherished. He knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to marry this woman, wanted to build a life with her, wanted to make their little makeshift family official and permanent. In October, as the aspens turned gold and the air took on the crisp bite of approaching winter, Yates rode into town to buy a ring. It was a simple gold band with a small emerald, modest by some standards, but the best the jeweler Enrico had to offer. He carried it in his pocket for a week, waiting for the right moment, getting more nervous by the day. The moment came on a Sunday afternoon. Rebecca had come for lunch, and after eating, they had all gone for a walk in the woods. The children ran ahead, chasing falling leaves and looking for interesting rocks, while Yates and Rebecca followed hand in hand. The light filtered through the golden aspen leaves, dappling everything in amber, and the world felt magical in the way only autumn in the mountains can. "Rebecca," Yates said, stopping in a small clearing where a stream burbled over smooth stones. His voice was shaking, and his hands were sweating despite the cool air. "I need to ask you something." She turned to him, her expression curious and a little concerned. "What is it?" He took a breath, then dropped to one knee on the forest floor, pulling the ring from his pocket. Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. "I am not good with words," Yates said, "and I'm still learning how to be a father and how to be worthy of love. But I know with absolute certainty that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to watch you teach our children, both the ones we already have and any that might come. I want to grow old with you in these mountains, building a life that matters. Rebecca Johnson, will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face, and she was nodding before he even finished speaking. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms and he was kissing her with all the love and passion he had been holding back, mindful of propriety and patience. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands in his hair, and he felt complete in a way he never had before. "Papa is kissing Miss Rebecca." Thomas's delighted shout broke them apart, and they turned to find all three children standing at the edge of the clearing, grinning like mad. Rose had tears on her cheeks, happy tears, and Lily was bouncing with excitement. "Does this mean she's going to be our mama?" Lily asked, running over to throw her arms around Rebecca's waist. Rebecca knelt down and hugged Lily tight, then opened her arms to include Rose and Thomas. "If you will have me," she said, looking at each of them in turn, "I would be honored to be your mama." "We would love that," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "We would love that more than anything." They were married in November, a small ceremony in the schoolhouse with most of the town in attendance. Yates wore his best suit, feeling awkward and constrained, but the look on Rebecca's face when she walked down the aisle made every uncomfortable moment worth it. She was wearing a simple ivory dress, her hair pinned up with wildflowers despite the season, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The children stood beside them during the ceremony, part of the vows they were making. Yates promised to love and cherish Rebecca, to be faithful and true, to build a life with her. Rebecca promised the same, and then added her own vows to Rose, Lily, and Thomas, promising to love them as her own, to protect them and guide them, to be the mother they deserved. There was not a dry eye in the schoolhouse when they finished, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the children cheered louder than anyone. They had a celebration at the cabin that lasted well into the night, friends and neighbors bringing food and gifts, playing music and dancing. Yates danced with his wife, marveling at how that word sounded, and then danced with each of his daughters, making them giggle when he deliberately stepped on his own feet. He let Thomas stand on his boots and waltzed him around the room, and he felt a joy so profound it was almost frightening in its intensity. When everyone finally left and the children were asleep, Yates carried Rebecca over the threshold of their bedroom, the small addition he had built onto the cabin over the past month. He set her down gently, his hands trembling slightly, suddenly nervous despite everything they had already shared. "I love you," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." "I know," Rebecca said, smiling up at him with so much love it took his breath away. "I love you too, all of you. Your strength and your gentleness and your big heart that you try so hard to protect. You are mine now, Yates Sullivan, and I am never letting you go." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and proceeded to show her exactly how much he loved her, how much he had wanted her, how grateful he was that she had chosen him despite all his rough edges and fears. They came together with passion and tenderness, learning each other's bodies, taking their time because they had the rest of their lives ahead of them. And when they finally fell asleep tangled together, Yates felt a peace he had never known, the kind that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be with exactly who you were supposed to be with. Winter came early that year, snow falling in thick blankets by mid-November, but the cabin was warm and full of life. Rebecca moved in fully, bringing her books and clothes and the little personal touches that made the space feel like a true home. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse, riding down with Rose each morning and returning each evening, while Yates cared for Lily and Thomas and tended to the work that kept them fed and sheltered. It was a good life, a full life, and Yates found himself thinking less and less about his past traumas and more about the future they were building. The children thrived under Rebecca's influence, all three of them blossoming with the security of knowing they were loved and wanted. Rose excelled in school and talked about maybe becoming a teacher herself someday. Lily showed an aptitude for music, and Yates saved up to buy her a small dulcimer that she practiced on for hours. Thomas followed Yates everywhere, learning to chop wood and care for the animals, proudly calling himself Papa's helper. Christmas that year was magical. Yates and Rebecca stayed up late on Christmas Eve, assembling gifts they had made or bought, a rag doll for Lily, a set of books for Rose, a wooden horse for Thomas. In the morning, the children's joy was infectious, and Yates realized this was his first real Christmas since before the war, the first time the holiday felt like something other than a painful reminder of what he had lost. In February, on the anniversary of the night he had found the children in his barn, Yates woke before dawn and went out to that same barn. He stood in the spot where they had been huddled, trying to remember the terror he had felt, the way his heart had nearly stopped when he realized how close they had come to dying. It felt like a lifetime ago now, like something that had happened to a different person. In a way, it had. The man who had found those children was not the same man who stood here now. That man had been alone and broken, convinced that isolation was safety. This man had a wife he loved more than life itself, 3 children who called him Papa, and a future that stretched ahead full of promise instead of emptiness. "I wondered if I would find you here," Rebecca's voice said softly from the doorway. She was wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she crossed the barn to stand beside him. "What are you thinking about?" "About how much everything has changed," Yates said, pulling her close. "About how I almost did not go out to check the barn that night. I was tired and the storm was bad, and I thought about waiting until morning. If I had, they would have died, and I never would have known what I was missing." Rebecca leaned her head against his chest, right over his heart. "But you did go out. You saved them, and in doing so, you saved yourself. That is how love works, Yates. We give it away, and somehow end up with more than we started with." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, lavender, and something uniquely her. "I am glad you came to Rico. I am glad you did not give up on me when I was too stubborn to see what was right in front of me." "I am patient," Rebecca said with a smile in her voice. "And you were worth waiting for." Spring brought new life to the mountains and new joy to the Sullivan household. In April, Rebecca told Yates that she was pregnant, that they were going to have a baby come late autumn. Yates was stunned, then elated, then terrified, cycling through emotions so fast he made himself dizzy. He had always assumed his family would be Rose, Lily, and Thomas, and while he was thrilled at the idea of a child with Rebecca, he was also worried about how the other children would react, whether they would feel displaced or less loved. His worries proved unfounded. Rose was excited to help with the baby. Lily immediately started making lists of names, and Thomas declared he would teach the baby everything he knew about being strong like Papa. Their enthusiasm eased Yates's fears and filled him with renewed wonder at how lucky he was to have them. The summer passed in a blur of preparation. Yates built a cradle from smooth pine, carving intricate designs into the wood during the evenings while Rebecca sewed tiny clothes. The children helped in their own ways, Rose reading books about babies to prepare herself, Lily making a soft blanket, Thomas collecting smooth stones that he said the baby could play with someday. In November, as the first snows began to fall, Rebecca went into labor. It was long and difficult, and Yates paced outside their bedroom like a caged animal, terrified and helpless. The midwife from town was there, as was an older woman who had assisted with many births, but it did not ease his fear. He could hear Rebecca's cries of pain, and it took everything in him not to burst through the door and demand they do something to help her. Rose sat with him, holding his hand, her young face serious. "She will be all right, Papa. Mama is strong." Mama. Rebecca was Mama now, not Miss Rebecca or Miss Johnson. It had happened gradually, naturally, until one day all three children were calling her that without even thinking about it. And every time Yates heard it, his heart swelled. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, a new sound filled the cabin. A baby's cry, loud and strong and perfect. Yates was on his feet immediately, and the midwife opened the door with a tired smile. "You have a son, Mr. Sullivan, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Yates entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Rebecca was propped up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in Lily's blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Come meet your son." He crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the impossibly small face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had dark hair like his, and when his eyes opened briefly, they were blue. Yates reached out with one massive, scarred hand and gently touched the baby's cheek, overwhelmed by how soft and fragile he was. "He is perfect," Yates whispered, his voice breaking. "You are perfect. Thank you. Thank you for this gift." "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked, leaning her head against Yates's shoulder. They had discussed names but never settled on one, wanting to wait until they met the baby. Yates thought for a moment, then said, "What about Samuel? It means asked of God. And I feel like this whole family, everything we have, is something I did not know I was allowed to ask for but received anyway." "Samuel Sullivan," Rebecca said, testing the name. "It is perfect. Samuel Yates Sullivan." The older children were allowed in then, and they crowded around the bed, wide-eyed and reverent. Rose touched the baby's hand with one finger, and tiny Samuel wrapped his whole fist around it. Lily whispered that he was beautiful. Thomas looked at Yates and said, "He is really small, Papa. Are you sure he is supposed to be that small?" Everyone laughed, and in that moment, Yates felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. His family, his wife, his children, the life he had built from the ashes of loneliness and pain. It was messy and chaotic, and nothing like what he had planned, but it was beautiful beyond measure. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Samuel was a good baby, but he still needed to be fed and changed and rocked at all hours. Yates took over many of Rebecca's household duties so she could rest and care for the baby, and he discovered he was actually decent at cooking and cleaning when he put his mind to it. The older children helped too, Rose especially, who seemed to have a natural gift for soothing Samuel when he fussed. In the spring, when Samuel was 6 months old and starting to smile and laugh, Yates took stock of his life and felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. He had everything he had never known to want, everything he had been too afraid to hope for. And it had all started with a stormy night and 3 children freezing in his barn, a moment that had changed the trajectory of his entire existence. He shared these thoughts with Rebecca one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Samuel asleep in her arms, the older children playing in the yard. She listened with that quiet attention she always gave him, then reached over and took his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your solitude, your quiet life?" Yates laughed, a deep, genuine sound that came from his belly. "Not for a single second. That life, it was not living. It was just existing, waiting to die. This life, with all its noise and chaos and mess, this is what it means to be alive. You and the children, you saved me just as much as I saved them that night." Rebecca kissed him softly. "Then we saved each other. And we will keep saving each other, every day for the rest of our lives." The years passed and the Sullivan family grew in love and strength. Rose graduated from the schoolhouse at the top of her class and began helping Rebecca teach the younger students, eventually taking over full-time when Rebecca became pregnant again. Their second child together was a daughter they named Grace, born in the summer of 1881 when Samuel was nearly 2. She had Rebecca's auburn hair and green eyes, and she was as sweet-tempered as Samuel was energetic. Lily grew into a talented musician, playing at town gatherings and bringing joy wherever she went. Thomas became his father's shadow, learning everything Yates could teach him about surviving and thriving in the mountains. And Samuel, their surprise blessing, grew into a sturdy boy who had inherited his father's strength and his mother's kindness. In 1883, Rebecca gave birth to twins, a boy and girl they named Matthew and Emma. The cabin was bursting at the seams then, full of noise and laughter and the constant motion of children. Yates built an addition, then another, until the small cabin he had lived in alone had become a sprawling house that could accommodate their growing family. The children from the barn, as Yates sometimes still thought of them, never forgot where they came from or what they had survived. But they also never doubted that they were loved and wanted, that they belonged to this family as much as any child born into it. Rose went on to become a teacher like Rebecca, eventually starting her own school in a neighboring town. Lily married a kind musician who valued her talent and her spirit. Thomas took over the family property when Yates's joints started to ache from old war wounds and a lifetime of hard labor. And through it all, Yates and Rebecca remained deeply, profoundly in love. They had their arguments and hard times, periods when money was tight or illness struck or the weight of raising 7 children felt overwhelming. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other, never forgetting the miracle of having found each other against all odds. On their 20th anniversary, Yates took Rebecca back to the barn where it had all begun. It was February again, though not as cold as that fateful night 2 decades earlier. They stood in the same spot where he had found Rose, Lily, and Thomas, and Yates pulled his wife close. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not gone out that night?" he asked. "If they had died, or if someone else had found them?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "No, because I believe some things are meant to be. Those children were meant to survive. You were meant to find them, and I was meant to find all of you. We were all lost in our own ways, and we found each other. That is not chance, Yates. That is fate." Yates thought about the man he had been, the one who had fled human connection and convinced himself he was better off alone. He thought about the journey that had brought him from there to here, to this barn, to this woman, to the life that waited for them back in the house full of children and noise and unconditional love. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he said them. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I know," Rebecca said, smiling up at him with those green eyes that still made his heart race. "And I will love you just as long. We are forever, Yates Sullivan, you, me, and all the beautiful chaos we have created together." They kissed in the barn, surrounded by ghosts of what could have been and the reality of what was, and then they walked back to their house hand in hand. Through the windows, they could see their children gathered for the anniversary dinner. Rose had brought her husband and newborn daughter. Lily and her musician were there with their son. Thomas was setting the table, while Samuel and Grace argued over something trivial, and the twins ran wild the way 4-year-olds did. It was loud and messy and imperfect, and it was everything Yates had never known he needed. He had come to these mountains to escape life, and instead he had found it in its fullest, most beautiful form. He had found family, he had found love, he had found purpose, and it had all started with 3 children freezing in his barn, 3 small lives that had needed saving, never knowing that in saving them, Yates Sullivan would save himself. They went inside to the warmth and the noise, to the family they had built from loss and loneliness and sheer determination to create something good in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Rebecca squeezed his hand once before releasing it, and Yates knew she was thinking the same thing he was. They had made it. Against all odds, through all the pain and fear and uncertainty, they had made it to the other side. They had created a legacy of love that would outlast them both, a family that would carry forward the lessons they had learned about resilience and compassion, and the power of opening your heart even when it terrified you. As Yates sat down to dinner surrounded by everyone he loved, he offered up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had led him out into that storm 20 years ago. He thanked God or fate or simple chance for not letting him wait until morning, for giving him the courage to open his door and his heart, for showing him that the greatest adventure was not in solitude, but in connection. The meal was delicious, the conversation lively, and the laughter abundant. Samuel told jokes that made Grace groan. The twins spilled their milk twice, and Rose's baby fussed until Yates took her and walked her around the room, bouncing her gently the way he had learned to do with 7 children. She quieted immediately, looking up at him with dark eyes full of trust, and his heart squeezed with love. Later, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Yates and Rebecca sat by the fire in the quiet house. Samuel's cradle, long since passed down to all their children, and now to Rose's daughter, sat empty in the corner, a reminder of how far they had come. Rebecca leaned against Yates's chest, his arms wrapped around her, and they watched the flames dance in comfortable silence. "We did good," Rebecca said finally, her voice soft. "With this life, with these children. We did real good." "We did," Yates agreed, kissing the top of her head, "better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you think they know?" Rebecca asked. "Rose and Lily and Thomas, do you think they know how much they changed everything? How much we needed them as much as they needed us?" "I think they do," Yates said. "I think they feel it the same way we do. We are all pieces of the same whole. We found each other when we were all lost, and we made something beautiful together." They sat there until the fire burned low, until the cold started to creep in, and it was time to bank the embers and go to bed. But before they did, Yates stood and looked out the window at the barn, dark against the starlit sky. He thought about that night one more time, about the choice he had made to go out into the storm, about how different his life would be if he had made a different choice. But he had not. He had gone out. He had found them. And in finding them, he had found everything. Yates turned away from the window and took Rebecca's hand, leading her to their bedroom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of chaos and beauty. But tonight, he was simply grateful. Grateful for the family that filled his house, for the wife who had chosen him, for the children who had taught him how to love without fear. He climbed into bed and pulled Rebecca close, feeling her warmth against him, hearing her breathing even out as she drifted toward sleep. And as Yates Sullivan closed his eyes, the last thing he thought was that he was the luckiest man alive, not because life had been easy, but because when it mattered most, he had been brave enough to open his door to the storm, and everything beautiful had followed from that single moment of courage. The mountains stood eternal outside his window, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and inside a house that had once echoed with loneliness, a family slept in peace and love and perfect contentment. The story that had begun with 3 orphans freezing in a barn had become a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of compassion and the miracle of second chances. And they all lived, truly and fully lived, happily ever after in the wild, beautiful mountains of Colorado, where a mountain man had once found 3 children and in saving them had been saved himself, where love had bloomed against all odds, and where family had been forged, not by blood alone, but by choice and courage, and hearts brave enough to hope.